You really thought someone like you could get past this gate? Officer Brad Collins said with a crooked smile that carried farther than the flashing blue lights behind him. A few people waiting at the gas pumps glanced over, then quickly looked away, choosing silence over involvement. The afternoon sun hung low above the pine trees surrounding Maxwell Air Force Base outside Montgomery, Alabama, casting long golden reflections across the windshields of passing trucks. A weathered gray sedan rolled to a quiet stop beside the security checkpoint leading toward the military access road. The car was clean but old enough to attract unwanted assumptions. Behind the wheel sat a black woman in her early 40s wearing a faded charcoal hoodie, worn blue jeans, and sneakers that had clearly traveled many miles. Her hair was tucked beneath a simple baseball cap, and nothing about her appearance suggested prestige, authority, or influence. She looked like someone determined to stay unnoticed, and for nearly an hour, she had succeeded. Until now. Brad adjusted the body camera clipped to his uniform and stepped closer, resting one hand against the roof of her car while studying her driver's license longer than necessary. His expression never softened. Experience had taught him to trust appearances more than paperwork, or at least that was what he liked to believe. Around him, two younger officers watched quietly, taking silent cues from the veteran who had spent nearly 2 decades wearing the badge. Traffic continued flowing toward the base entrance. Military families driving minivans, contractors showing identification, delivery trucks rumbling through after routine inspections. Yet Brad seemed interested in only one vehicle. He slowly circled the sedan, his boots crunching against loose gravel, occasionally glancing toward the woman inside as though expecting nervousness, excuses, or anger. Instead, she rested both hands calmly on the steering wheel and waited. Her breathing remained steady. Her eyes followed every movement without challenge or fear. That composure irritated him more than any argument could have. "You headed somewhere important?" he finally asked, his voice carrying enough sarcasm for nearby drivers to hear. "Yes, officer," she answered evenly. "I have business beyond the gate." Brad laughed under his breath. "Business? That's interesting." He leaned slightly toward the open window. "People dressed like you usually don't have business inside a restricted military area." The words lingered in the warm air. A middle-aged mechanic filling his pickup froze for a brief second before lowering his head. A young mother standing beside her SUV quietly guided her son toward the convenience store entrance, unwilling to let him witness what adults sometimes became. The woman inside the sedan neither flinched nor raised her voice. "May I ask why I've been stopped?" she said politely. Brad ignored the question. His attention shifted toward an elderly black man sitting alone on a nearby bench with a small backpack resting beside him. The old veteran had been waiting for a shuttle scheduled to arrive within minutes. His faded service cap displayed ribbons from decades earlier, though few people seemed to notice anymore. Brad pointed toward him with an impatient wave. "First him. Now you. Seems like everyone's trying to wander where they don't belong today." The woman looked briefly toward the veteran, then back at the officer. Something almost invisible crossed her face. Not anger, not fear. Recognition. Quiet recognition. Above them, an American flag rippled sharply in the afternoon breeze, its steady movement reflecting across the polished hood of a passing military SUV. Beyond the checkpoint, the distant sound of marching cadence drifted from somewhere inside the base, rhythmic, disciplined, familiar. The woman listened for only a heartbeat before returning her attention to Brad Collins, who had absolutely no idea that every assumption he had made during the last 2 minutes was bringing him closer to the single moment that would redefine his entire career. Brad Collins folded his arms as though the silence itself proved his point. The woman behind the wheel remained still, her fingers resting lightly on the steering wheel, her expression calm enough to unsettle anyone expecting confrontation. She had spent most of her adult life learning that composure could accomplish what raised voices never could. Her name was Naomi Brooks, although no one standing outside the sedan recognized it. To them, she was simply another traveler wearing ordinary clothes, another face that blended into the background. That was exactly how she preferred it. 3 days earlier, she had left the Pentagon without dress blues, ribbons, or insignia, carrying only a small duffel bag and a folder sealed inside a plain canvas case. The assignment required observation, not recognition. Senior officials had quietly authorized an independent inspection of several installations after reports describing inconsistent treatment of civilians, veterans, and military families near restricted facilities. Uniforms changed behavior. Rank changed conversations. Respect often appeared only after stars or eagles were visible on a collar. Naomi wanted to see what happened before anyone knew who she was. She had accepted the mission immediately because it reminded her of lessons her late father had taught decades earlier. He had served 26 years in the United States Air Force as an aircraft mechanic and always said that character revealed itself most clearly when nobody believed another person could answer back. As a little girl growing up near Biloxi, Mississippi, Naomi remembered polishing his old boots before school while listening to stories about teamwork, sacrifice, and dignity. He never described greatness through medals or promotions. He described it through quiet decisions made when nobody was watching. Those memories stayed with her through the Air Force Academy, overseas deployments, command responsibilities, and ceremonies where distinguished service medals were carefully pinned across her uniform. Yet the proudest moments of her career had never happened beneath bright lights. They came during long nights inside aircraft hangars, disaster relief operations after hurricanes, and conversations with frightened young airmen who simply needed someone willing to listen. That morning, she had already visited 2 communities surrounding the base. She stopped at a family diner where the waitress smiled at every customer equally. She spent 20 minutes speaking with an elderly Vietnam veteran who struggled to receive transportation to medical appointments. She quietly purchased lunch for a military spouse juggling 2 children while her husband remained deployed overseas. None of those people knew they had shared breakfast or conversation with one of the highest-ranking officers on the installation. Naomi intended to keep it that way until the assignment ended. The inspection was never about catching individuals making mistakes. It was about understanding culture. Respect could never exist only inside official policies. It had to exist in ordinary conversations between strangers. Back at the checkpoint, she noticed the elderly veteran still waiting on the bench, gently adjusting the brim of his faded cap as another shuttle drove past without stopping. The afternoon heat climbed past 85 degrees, and sunlight shimmered across the pavement. Naomi watched him carefully because she recognized the quiet patience worn by people who had spent years serving something larger than themselves. Officer Collins followed her gaze and mistook compassion for distraction. He smiled to himself, believing the conversation was unfolding exactly as he expected. Naomi simply took one slow breath, looked toward the American flag waving beyond the gate once more, and reminded herself that every meaningful test of leadership began long before anyone offered a salute. Officer Brad Collins glanced at his watch before slipping Naomi Brooks's driver license into the front pocket of his uniform without returning it. The small gesture was deliberate. It reminded people who controlled the conversation. Behind him, another patrol vehicle rolled slowly into the checkpoint, its engine humming softly before stopping beneath the shade of an oak tree. Deputy Eric Lawson stepped out carrying a clipboard and a bottle of water. He nodded toward Brad, but immediately noticed the unusual tension surrounding the gray sedan. "Everything all right?" Eric asked quietly. Brad shrugged with casual confidence. "Routine stop. Just making sure people understand where they do and do not belong." Eric looked toward Naomi for only a moment. She met his eyes with the same composed expression she had maintained since arriving. There was no panic in her posture. No pleading, no frustration, only patience. Something about that unsettled him, although he could not explain why. Years of law enforcement had taught Eric that nervous people often became loud. Calm people usually knew more than they revealed. Brad interpreted the silence differently. To him, it was simply another reminder that authority worked best when no one questioned it. Nearby, the elderly veteran slowly stood from the bench after noticing another shuttle approaching from the opposite side of the road. He adjusted the faded Air Force cap resting carefully above his silver hair and picked up his worn backpack. Before he could take more than a few steps, Brad lifted one hand without even looking directly at him. "Hold on there. Stay where you are until I finish over here." The old veteran stopped immediately and nodded without complaint. Naomi watched the exchange carefully. She recognized the ribbons embroidered on the weathered cap. Although faded by years of sunlight, they represented honorable service stretching back decades. She also noticed something else. The veteran leaned slightly on his right leg, favoring an old injury that years of military discipline had never completely erased. The afternoon breeze carried the distant sound of aircraft engines from inside the base. A pair of training jets climbed into the bright Alabama sky, leaving thin white trails that stretched toward the horizon. Naomi followed them with her eyes for only a second. Flying had always centered her thoughts. Every promotion she had earned, every command she had accepted, every medal pinned across her dress uniform had begun with the same oath to serve something greater than herself. She quietly reminded herself that the oath did not become less meaningful simply because another person failed to honor it. Brad broke the silence again. "So tell me, Miss Brooks, what exactly is so important beyond that gate?" Naomi answered with the same steady voice. "Meeting people who have dedicated their lives to this country." Brad chuckled. "That sounds impressive." He looked at the faded hoodie she wore and shook his head. "Funny thing is, people who actually belong on that base usually look the part." Eric shifted uncomfortably beside him but remained silent. Several civilians waiting in nearby vehicles pretended not to listen, although every window seemed slightly lower than before. Naomi could feel curious eyes following every word, yet she refused to match sarcasm with sarcasm. "Appearances can be incomplete, officer," she replied. Brad smiled wider. "Not usually." He stepped closer and lowered his voice just enough to sound confident instead of loud. "Around here, experience tells me everything I need to know." Naomi held his gaze without blinking. Deep inside the base, a convoy of dark military sport utility vehicles turned onto the main access road exactly 3 minutes ahead of schedule, carrying senior officers who had no idea their afternoon briefing was about to begin somewhere entirely unexpected. The shuttle finally pulled to the curb with a soft hiss of air brakes. The elderly veteran reached for the handrail, but before he could take another step, Brad Collins lifted his voice across the pavement. "I said wait." The driver glanced toward the checkpoint, uncertain whether to leave or remain. After several uncomfortable seconds, the doors closed again, and the shuttle slowly pulled away, disappearing around a curve lined with towering pine trees. The old veteran lowered his eyes for only a moment before quietly returning to the bench. He did not complain. He simply sat back down, resting both hands on the backpack that carried everything he had brought for the day. Naomi watched the shuttle disappear into the distance. A faint sigh escaped her lips. It was almost invisible, almost impossible to notice, but it carried the weight of years spent defending people who rarely asked for anything beyond simple respect. She opened her driver's side door carefully and stepped onto the warm pavement. The afternoon sun reflected across the hood of her aging sedan, while a gentle breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass from somewhere inside the installation. Brad immediately straightened. "I did not tell you to get out of the car." Naomi kept her hands relaxed at her sides. "Officer Collins, that gentleman missed his transportation because of this stop. He served this country. He deserves better than being left waiting in the heat." Brad gave a dismissive laugh. "You do not get to lecture me about service." Naomi looked toward the veteran again before answering. "Service is not measured by a uniform someone is wearing today. Sometimes it is measured by the one they wore years ago." The words landed softly, but several people standing near the fuel pumps quietly turned to listen. Eric Lawson shifted his weight and looked toward the veteran, noticing for the first time the faded ribbons embroidered across the old cap. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. Brad noticed it too and immediately redirected the conversation. "This is exactly what I expected," he said. "People show up, create distractions, then tell officers how to do their jobs." Naomi remained composed. "No, officer. I simply asked that he be treated with dignity." Brad stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. "Around here, I decide what dignity looks like." The silence that followed felt unusually heavy. Even the steady flow of traffic seemed to slow as drivers watched through partially lowered windows. Somewhere beyond the security fence, another formation of aircraft climbed into the brilliant blue Alabama sky, their engines producing a deep, familiar roar that echoed across the open landscape. Naomi instinctively looked upward for a brief second. The sound carried memories of countless takeoffs, long deployments, and young pilots saluting before missions that demanded courage instead of recognition. When she lowered her eyes again, her expression remained unchanged. Calm. Patient. Certain. Brad mistook that calm for surrender. If you are finished interfering, he said, you can get back in your car and wait until I decide what happens next. Naomi slowly nodded. I will wait. Then she added in the same measured tone, but I hope, before today ends, every decision made here reflects the values that flag behind you is supposed to represent. Brad glanced toward the American flag flying high above the entrance and smirked as though the remark meant nothing. What he could not see was the line of dark military sport utility vehicles now approaching the checkpoint from inside the installation, their polished windshields catching the afternoon sunlight as they closed the distance one steady mile at a time. The lead vehicle in the approaching convoy was still hidden behind a gentle curve, but the faint glimmer of sunlight bouncing off dark windshields grew brighter with every passing second. None of the people gathered near the checkpoint noticed it yet. Their attention remained fixed on the quiet woman standing beside the aging gray sedan and the officer who seemed increasingly determined to prove a point. Brad Collins took one slow step forward and held out his hand. Keys. Naomi looked at him calmly. May I ask why? His jaw tightened. Because I asked for them. Without hesitation, she placed the car keys into his palm. There was no argument, no hesitation, no attempt to challenge his authority. Brad seemed almost disappointed by how easily she complied. He walked around the sedan, opened the driver's side door, and glanced inside. The interior was spotless. A folded road map rested beside a reusable water bottle. A small duffel bag sat neatly on the back seat, and a plain canvas document case lay secured beneath it. Nothing looked unusual. Nothing looked threatening. Eric Lawson quietly approached from the passenger side. Do you want me to document the inspection? He asked. Brad nodded without taking his eyes off the vehicle. Everything gets documented. Eric removed a small notepad and began recording the time, location, and vehicle information. As he looked through the open door, he noticed a framed photograph tucked into the center console. It showed a much younger Naomi standing beside an older African-American man wearing an Air Force maintenance uniform. Both were smiling beneath the wing of a transport aircraft. Eric studied the picture for a brief moment before looking away. Brad noticed his hesitation. What? Eric shrugged. Nothing. Just looks like military family. Brad dismissed the observation with a wave. Lots of people have relatives in the military. Naomi remained where she stood, watching quietly as warm afternoon light stretched long shadows across the pavement. She had experienced inspections before. Some were routine. Some were necessary. What mattered was how they were conducted. A few moments later, Brad lifted the canvas document case from the back seat. What is this? He asked. Official paperwork, Naomi answered truthfully. Related to my assignment. Brad smiled as though he had caught her in a contradiction. Assignment. He slowly turned toward the growing crowd of curious onlookers. Now we are getting somewhere. Naomi kept her voice steady. Those documents contain sensitive government material. Please handle them carefully. Instead of acknowledging the request, Brad looked toward Eric again. Did you hear that? Sensitive government material. His tone carried unmistakable skepticism. Eric accepted the case carefully, feeling its unexpected weight. Attached to the zipper was a plain government identification tag without any visible rank or title. Before he could examine it more closely, Brad reached over and took it back. I will handle this. Naomi met his eyes. Officer Collins, I respectfully ask that you verify the authorization number printed on the security seal before opening it. Brad gave a short laugh. You are still giving instructions. No, Naomi replied softly. I am trying to prevent an unnecessary mistake. The words lingered in the still afternoon air. Somewhere beyond the entrance gate, the convoy rounded the final curve. The first vehicle slowed as uniformed security personnel recognized the passengers inside. At the checkpoint, however, Brad remained completely unaware. He rested one hand on the sealed document case, convinced he was about to expose an ordinary citizen pretending to be important. While only a few hundred yards away, the people who had authorized that very case were arriving precisely where they expected one of their most respected officers to be waiting. The afternoon seemed to pause. Even the steady breeze that had stirred the American flag all day softened until the fabric moved with slow, measured waves against the bright Alabama sky. Brad Collins rested the sealed government document case on the hood of the gray sedan, studying the security seal with growing impatience. The number printed beneath the transparent strip meant nothing to him, and he made no effort to verify it. To Brad, confidence had always been enough to replace caution. Naomi Brooks stood several feet away with her hands loosely folded in front of her. She neither stepped forward nor protested. Years of military leadership had taught her that the loudest voice rarely carried the greatest authority. Sometimes the strongest decision was simply allowing another person enough space to reveal who they truly were. Eric Lawson watched quietly from the side of the vehicle. Something continued to trouble him. He looked again toward the government tag attached to the document case, then toward Naomi. Nothing about her behavior matched the situations he had experienced during ordinary traffic stops. There was no nervous pacing, no hurried explanations, no attempt to impress anyone. Instead, she waited with the calm discipline of someone completely certain that truth did not require urgency. Across the road, the elderly veteran slowly removed his Air Force cap and wiped a bead of perspiration from his forehead with a neatly folded handkerchief before placing the cap carefully back on his head. Naomi noticed the small gesture and smiled almost imperceptibly. She recognized the habit immediately. Her own father had done the very same thing before every military ceremony, treating even an old service cap with quiet respect. The memory settled warmly inside her as distant aircraft crossed overhead once more, their engines blending into a familiar rhythm that reminded her of countless dawn departures and late-night returns from missions scattered across the world. She remembered young officers searching her face before difficult assignments, waiting to see whether their commander looked worried. She never allowed fear to become contagious. Leadership demanded steadiness first. Everything else came later. Brad finally broke the silence. "You have been unusually patient," he said without looking up from the case. Naomi answered gently. "Patience gives people time to make better decisions." He smirked. "Or bigger mistakes?" She met his eyes. "Sometimes they are the same thing." The words lingered between them longer than either expected. Eric lowered his pen. He could not explain why, but the conversation no longer felt like an ordinary encounter. It felt like an examination where nobody had realized the test had already begun. Around the fuel station, ordinary life continued almost strangely. A delivery truck rolled past carrying fresh produce for the commissary. Two children laughed while sharing a cold drink outside the convenience store. Somewhere nearby, the smell of fresh coffee drifted through the warm air as the afternoon sun reflected across polished windshields. Yet beneath that peaceful surface, something invisible was changing. Beyond the security gate, the approaching convoy slowed almost to a crawl. Military police at the entrance immediately recognized the lead vehicle and raised the access barrier without delay. The first sport utility vehicle entered the outer checkpoint, followed closely by two more. Their polished black paint reflected the waving American flag like moving mirrors. Eric glanced toward the convoy, then back at Naomi, and for the first time all afternoon, an uneasy thought crossed his mind. What if the quiet woman beside the gray sedan was not waiting for permission to enter the base at all? What if the base itself had been waiting for her to arrive? The first black sport utility vehicle came to a smooth stop just inside the checkpoint, followed by two identical vehicles that formed a quiet line beneath the fluttering American flag. Their engines settled into a low hum before every door opened almost simultaneously. 4 Air Force security personnel stepped out first, scanning the area with practiced precision, but instead of moving toward the installation, they looked directly at the gray sedan. Brad Collins frowned. "Looks like somebody important is arriving," he muttered, still keeping one hand on the sealed government case. Eric Lawson did not answer. His eyes were fixed on the senior officer emerging from the lead vehicle. Brigadier General Daniel Mercer adjusted his service cap, buttoned his dress jacket, and walked forward with measured confidence. Behind him came 2 full colonels, a command chief master sergeant, and a civilian official carrying a leather portfolio embossed with the Department of the Air Force seal. None of them looked toward the gate. None of them acknowledged the checkpoint itself. Every pair of eyes settled on Naomi Brooks. The world seemed to grow strangely quiet. The distant traffic faded beneath the rhythmic sound of polished dress, shoes crossing the pavement. Brad straightened instinctively, expecting the delegation to stop before him. Instead, General Mercer walked directly past him without slowing. Eric's heartbeat quickened as he noticed something he had not seen in years. The general's expression carried genuine respect before he had spoken a single word. When he reached Naomi, he stopped precisely 1 pace away and raised a perfect military salute. Every uniformed member of the delegation immediately followed. "Good afternoon, Colonel Brooks," General Mercer said clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Welcome to Maxwell Air Force Base. We apologize for the unexpected delay. Headquarters has been waiting for your arrival." Naomi returned the salute with calm precision. "Good afternoon, General Mercer." "Thank you." The silence that followed was unlike anything Brad had ever experienced. It was not the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence that arrives when reality suddenly replaces assumption. Brad slowly looked from Naomi to the general, then toward the officers standing at rigid attention behind him. His hand loosened around the government document case. Eric stared at Naomi with widened eyes as every unanswered question from the past hours suddenly found its answer. General Mercer noticed the sealed case resting on the hood of the sedan. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. "Colonel," he asked politely, "has your inspection material remained secure?" Naomi looked toward Brad before answering. "It has not been opened, General." Mercer nodded once before turning toward Brad Collins. His voice remained courteous, but every word carried unmistakable authority. "Officer, that case contains classified inspection documents authorized by the Department of the Air Force. Colonel Brooks is the lead officer assigned to today's command assessment." Brad's face lost its confidence. He quickly lifted the case with both hands, holding it as carefully as though it had suddenly become fragile crystal. "Sir, I did not realize." Mercer interrupted gently. "That is precisely why Colonel Brooks travels without insignia during these evaluations." Naomi accepted the document case from Brad with steady hands. She examined the untouched security seal for a brief moment before closing her eyes almost imperceptibly in relief. Nothing had been compromised. Across the road, the elderly veteran slowly rose from the bench. His weathered face softened into a proud smile as he quietly removed his faded Air Force cap once again. Naomi noticed him immediately. Before speaking another word to the general, she walked across the warm pavement toward the old veteran, extended her hand with genuine respect, and thanked him for his years of service. Watching from only a few feet away, Brad Collins finally understood that the greatest rank standing at the checkpoint had never announced itself. It had simply arrived wearing humility instead of medals. The old veteran accepted Naomi Brooks's handshake with both hands, his weathered eyes glistening beneath the brim of his faded Air Force cap. "Thank you, Colonel," he said softly. "It has been a long time since anyone called me by my rank instead of my age." Naomi smiled warmly. "Service never expires, Sergeant. Neither does honor." The words settled over the checkpoint with a quiet power that no raised voice could have matched. Several civilians who had witnessed the entire encounter lowered their heads in thoughtful silence. Eric Lawson slowly removed his own patrol cap without realizing he had done so, standing a little straighter as he watched the exchange. General Daniel Mercer allowed the moment to breathe before stepping beside Naomi. "Colonel, headquarters can wait another few minutes," he said. "There are some matters here that deserve attention first." Naomi nodded once. "I agree, General." Brad Collins remained where he stood, the confidence that had defined his posture all afternoon replaced by an uncomfortable stillness. He stared briefly at the pavement before finally looking toward Naomi. "Colonel Brooks," he began carefully, "I owe you an apology." His voice lacked the certainty it had carried only minutes earlier. "I made assumptions that I should not have made. I allowed appearances to shape my judgment, and I failed to show the respect every person deserves." The surrounding crowd remained silent. No one interrupted him. No one looked away. Naomi studied him for a long moment before answering. "Officer Collins, respect is not something you offer only after learning someone's title. If that had been my only lesson for today, this assignment would have failed." Brad lowered his eyes. "You are right." General Mercer turned toward Eric Lawson. "Deputy, was this interaction recorded?" Eric nodded immediately. "Yes, General. Body camera footage and checkpoint security cameras captured everything from the initial stop until your arrival." Mercer acknowledged him with a brief nod. "Good. Those recordings will become part of the official assessment." Brad inhaled slowly. He understood exactly what that meant. Yet before anyone else could speak, Naomi gently stepped forward. "General, I have one request." Mercer looked at her with quiet curiosity. "Go ahead, Colonel." I would prefer this become an opportunity for education before punishment. Accountability matters. So does growth. If we expect people to improve, we must leave room for them to choose a better path. The general considered her words for several seconds before answering. That recommendation reflects exactly why you were selected to lead this evaluation. He turned back toward Brad. Administrative procedures will follow their course. What happens afterward depends on what you learn from today. Brad looked at Naomi again, visibly humbled. I cannot change what happened this afternoon, he said. But I can change how I serve tomorrow. Naomi gave a small nod. Then make tomorrow worthy of the badge you wear. At that moment, another shuttle approached the checkpoint. Without waiting to be asked, Brad walked directly toward the elderly veteran and opened the passenger door himself. Sergeant, he said respectfully, your ride is here. The veteran smiled, adjusted his cap once more, and stepped aboard. Before the shuttle departed, he looked back through the open door and offered Naomi a crisp salute. She returned it immediately. As the vehicle disappeared beyond the gate, the warm afternoon sunlight reflected across the polished military vehicles and the weathered gray sedan alike, making them appear equal beneath the same bright sky, while everyone standing there understood that true leadership had never arrived inside the convoy. It had been waiting quietly beside an old car all along. The sun drifted lower over Maxwell Air Force Base, painting long bands of amber light across the pavement where the afternoon had quietly changed more than anyone could have predicted. The checkpoint gradually returned to its familiar rhythm. Vehicles moved forward one by one. Security barriers lifted and lowered with mechanical precision. Conversations resumed in softer voices. Yet something invisible had shifted, leaving behind a silence that felt different from the one that had existed only an hour earlier. Naomi Brooks picked up the small duffel bag from the back seat of her aging sedan before carefully placing the sealed government document case beneath her arm. She paused beside the driver's door for a brief moment, running her fingertips across the worn paint that had carried her through thousands of miles without ever drawing attention to itself. She smiled quietly. The old car had served today's mission perfectly. General Daniel Mercer approached once more, standing beside her rather than ahead of her. "Ready, Colonel?" he asked. Naomi looked toward the checkpoint one last time before answering. Almost. Her eyes settled on Officer Brad Collins, who was now greeting each arriving driver with a noticeably different posture. Every greeting carried patience. Every request sounded measured. When an elderly couple approached the gate, he stepped forward to help them understand the visitor process instead of rushing them aside. Nearby, Eric Lawson noticed the change as well. He did not say anything. He simply watched, hoping the lesson would last longer than the memory of embarrassment. Naomi understood that genuine transformation could never be guaranteed. It had to be chosen every single day. That was true in the military, in law enforcement, and in every community across the country. She walked toward Brad at an unhurried pace. Seeing her approach, he immediately stood straight. "Colonel Brooks." She offered a small, respectful nod. "Officer Collins." He hesitated before speaking. "I know today will stay in my record." Naomi answered gently. "Records matter. Character matters more. The report I submit will describe everything that happened, including what happened after the truth became known." Brad looked genuinely surprised. "You would include that?" "Of course," Naomi replied. "Leadership is measured by how people respond after recognizing a mistake, not only by the mistake itself." He lowered his eyes for a brief moment before extending her driver's license with both hands. "This belongs to you, ma'am." Naomi accepted it with a quiet smile. "Thank you, officer." There were no dramatic speeches after that. No celebration. No applause. General Mercer opened the rear door of the lead vehicle, but Naomi glanced toward her old sedan instead. "If you do not mind, General," she said with a hint of warmth, "I think I will drive myself in." Mercer smiled knowingly. "Somehow I thought you might." A few moments later, the convoy rolled forward through the gate, not leading Naomi, but following behind her weathered gray sedan as it crossed onto the installation. The American flag above the entrance continued to wave in the evening breeze, unchanged yet somehow carrying new meaning for everyone who had stood beneath it that afternoon. Far behind the checkpoint, the elderly veteran's shuttle disappeared into the distance while the fading sunlight reflected softly across his old service cap. Brad watched until every vehicle was gone, then looked up at the flag before quietly placing one hand over the badge on his uniform. For the first time in many years, he understood that authority could command attention, but only humility could earn respect. And as the last golden rays settled across the quiet roadway, the only sound that remained was the steady rustle of the flag above a gate that had witnessed not the triumph of rank, but the quiet victory of dignity.